The cruise began under a sky smeared with gray, the horizon barely visible, as if the ocean had swallowed the sun. James had expected calm waters and laughter, a familiar escape from the city. But the waves greeted the ship with an unnatural restlessness. The hull creaked under the swell, not in the comforting rhythm of a vessel cutting through water, but with a subtle, almost deliberate vibration that seemed to echo through his bones. Danny clung to him, small hands tight against his side, and James could feel the boy's tension mirrored by Lisa, her eyes darting to the deck, the railings, the horizon. The passengers moved in uneasy silence, hesitant and uncertain, as though the gray expanse beyond the ship carried a weight impossible to measure. Something about the ocean felt alive, aware, waiting. The first storm arrived abruptly. Waves rose taller than expected, curling with an unnatural grace, black-edged against the gray sky. Rain pelted the decks with a rhythmic insistence, water running in rivulets down the railings. The ship's engines hummed louder, a vibration threading through every steel beam, a pulse that seemed synchronized with the rolling water. Passengers clutched the rails, eyes wide, stomachs lurching. The horizon disappeared entirely, leaving only an endless gray blur. James moved through the corridors with care, each turn unfamiliar despite the layout he had memorized. Doors that had led to cabins now felt longer to reach. Staircases twisted subtly, as if the vessel itself were reshaping the space. A faint sense of wrongness lingered in the air, a tension that crept into muscles and nerves, refusing to be ignored. Danny followed silently, sketchbook in hand, recording shapes and angles he couldn't name. By evening, the storm had intensified. The low hum beneath the deck merged with the vibration of the waves, creating a resonance that seemed alive, a rhythm threading through walls, floors, and ceilings. Shadows moved oddly along corridors, bending around corners in ways that defied logic. James saw glimpses of passengers frozen mid-step, their expressions tight, faces pale and anxious. And then a subtle change. Some disappeared entirely, as if absorbed into the gray atmosphere. Meals were delayed. The dining hall, once cheerful with chatter, became subdued. Food appeared normal, yet the smell was strange, faintly metallic, unidentifiable. Passengers moved mechanically, eating without appetite, eyes flicking toward the horizon, toward the vibration beneath the hull, toward shadows that shifted unpredictably. James noticed one woman leave her chair mid-bite, walk down a corridor, and vanish. He checked the hallways, then the cabins. She was gone. No crew member could account for her. No log noted her presence. The family huddled in their cabin, listening to the creak and pulse of the ship. Outside, the ocean had turned a deeper gray, almost black, where the waves curved. The horizon was non-existent. Rain streaked the windows, blurring perception, blending sky and sea into a single, unbroken void. Danny whispered names of people he'd seen earlier, some missing, some still present. James felt a tightening in his chest. The disappearances weren't random. The ship, or the ocean, was selecting. Night arrived like a curtain of wet steel. The corridors narrowed in perception, walls pressing inward, corners darkened. James lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the hum beneath the hull, the vibration threading into the room. Shadows crawled along surfaces, stretching into impossible shapes, and he felt that the vessel itself was alive, watching, waiting, conscious. Even sleep felt risky, as if closing his eyes might allow the gray void to reach inside. Danny slept fitfully, murmuring names, tracing shapes in the air with his fingers, connecting memory and absence. Lisa stared at the window, eyes wide, unblinking, as if trying to pierce the unbroken gray beyond. James realized that the first day was not just a storm at sea. It was the beginning of something far older and far stranger. The ocean was patient, aware, immense, and the ship was its instrument, its conduit, a labyrinth designed to bend reality, observation, and fear itself. By the end of the first night, the family understood something profoundly unsettling. The cruise had become an initiation into a world apart. The ship vibrated in ways that could not be measured. The ocean pulsed with intent, and passengers were not merely travelers. They were subjects in an experiment they could not escape. The first day had ended, but the storm was far from over. The gray expanse waited. The ship waited. And James, Lisa, and Danny were caught in a rhythm older than memory, slower than time, and utterly unrelenting. The storm had passed, but the ship had changed. The gray expanse outside was calm, yet something intangible had shifted. The ocean no longer reflected light in the familiar way. It was flat, unbroken, almost glassy. Yet beneath the surface, James felt a pulsing rhythm that matched the hum of the ship's hull. Every creak of steel, every vibration through the floorboards seemed alive, deliberate, as if the vessel itself were aware of their presence. Corridors that had seemed straightforward the day before now felt distorted. Doors led to rooms he had never seen, hallways twisted in subtle angles, and staircases appeared where none should exist. James tried to memorize the layout, but the more he walked, the less reliable his memory became. Danny followed quietly, sketchbook in hand, drawing patterns of walls, shadows, and impossible angles. His pencil traced geometries that did not exist on the ship, but that mirrored the distortions James could sense in the air. Passengers had begun to notice the oddities. Some moved cautiously, avoiding certain corridors, whispering about doors that opened to nothing, lights that flickered independently of the switches, and corridors that seemed longer or shorter than yesterday. Others seemed unaware, walking mechanically, carrying out routines with unnatural precision, their faces blank, eyes unfocused. James had begun to suspect that the ship itself influenced perception, bending awareness and memory to suit an unknown purpose. The crew had changed as well. Previously friendly and approachable, they now moved with a precision that bordered on unnatural. Faces that once smiled or frowned were now static, eyes focused, hands performing tasks with exact timing. James observed one steward pour drinks at a table. The liquid never spilled, even as the tray tilted slightly. The glasses aligned perfectly, their contents untouched by motion. There was no human error, no hesitation, only deliberate, mechanical grace. Food service had also become strange. Meals arrived with perfect presentation, yet James could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The meat was darker, slick in a way that seemed unnatural, and vegetables glimmered with an unidentifiable sheen. Passengers ate in silence, chewing slowly, eyes flicking toward corridors or the distant horizon. One man set down his fork, then simply vanished, leaving the chair empty. The room remained still, only the faint hum of the hull filling the void. James felt the shift most acutely in the observation areas. The ocean stretched endlessly in gray monotony, reflecting no sun, no stars, no moon. Occasionally, subtle ripples appeared on the surface, patterns too deliberate to be caused by wind or current. Shapes moved beneath the waves, glimpses of dark forms, impossible to fully see, yet undeniably present. It was as though the sea itself watched, aware of every heartbeat aboard the ship. Cataloging, testing, waiting. Danny's sketches grew more intricate. Lines twisted, spiraled, overlapped, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with life. James realized that the boy was perceiving something adults could not. Forms and angles that existed only in the intersection of consciousness and reality. Lisa noticed it too, her gaze often fixed on Danny's pages, as if they contained a code to decipher the ship's strange behaviors. By mid-afternoon, James began to sense the ship's presence more acutely. The hum beneath the hull seemed to respond to movement, growing louder when passengers congregated, diminishing when hallways emptied. Shadows along the walls twisted, stretching toward the people who moved beneath them, subtly shifting the angle of light. James could not tell if it was an optical illusion or if the steel itself bent under influence. But the effect was undeniable. The ship was alive, aware, patient. Disappearances continued, though less overtly than during the storm. Chairs remained empty. Passengers wandered alone and never returned. And corridors occasionally seemed to swallow those who walked too quickly or turned the wrong corner. James learned to move cautiously, keeping Lisa and Danny close, observing patterns in the ship's layout, and recording every subtle shift he could perceive. The evening brought an uneasy calm. The ocean was still, yet James felt the pulse of it through the floor, threading into bones and nerves. He understood that the calm was deliberate. A pause, a moment for the ship to align its systems, test perceptions, and prepare for the next phase. Shadows in the hallways lengthened unnaturally. Light flickered with subtle patterns, and the air carried a low, almost imperceptible vibration, threading through consciousness like a warning. Night arrived with oppressive quiet. The family remained together in the cabin, staring through rain-streaked windows at the gray, unbroken horizon. Danny traced patterns in the air, mimicking shapes he had seen in sketches. Lisa's hands gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, eyes wide with understanding. James listened to the hum beneath the hull, recognizing that the ship was not merely a vessel. It was a living entity, shaping events, perception, and reality itself. By the end of the second day, the family understood one thing clearly. They were not merely passengers. They were observed. They were components in a system that spanned steel, water, and consciousness. And the rules of the voyage had already shifted beyond human comprehension. The ship waited. The ocean waited. And the shadows waited with deliberate patience. Their first day had been the storm. The second had revealed the strange intelligence guiding every movement. The cruise was no longer a vacation. It had become an initiation, a test, and the ocean, patient and aware, had only just begun. By the third day, unease aboard the ship had escalated into palpable fear. The gray ocean beyond the railing remained unbroken, an endless sheet that erased all sense of direction or distance. The low hum beneath the hull had intensified, threading through steel and bone alike, a constant reminder that the vessel was no longer just a machine. It was alive, responsive, deliberate. James noticed the first vanishings mid-morning. A man had been walking alone down the main corridor, briefcase in hand, when he simply faded. One moment he was there. The next, only the corridor remained. No doors, no hidden spaces, no traces, just emptiness. Other passengers noticed and froze, eyes wide, unsure whether to react. The hum of the ship carried on, indifferent, as though acknowledging the absence, but not the observer. The disappearances were not random. James observed patterns, those who wandered too far, those who lingered too long in certain corridors, those who focused their attention on the gray horizon outside the windows. The ship seemed to measure their movements, their awareness, their responses. One misplaced step could be enough. He tightened his grip on Danny's hand, keeping him close, aware that the child's sensitivity to the ship's distortions might make him a target or a conduit. Passengers reacted differently. Some retreated entirely to cabins, shutting doors and barricading themselves with fear. Others roamed obsessively, tracing hallways that twisted into impossible loops, trying to make sense of the vessel's ever-changing geometry. Faces became pale, eyes unfocused, movements erratic. The ship observed all, bending space, perception, and reality to suit some incomprehensible design. Danny, sketchbook in hand, continued to document what he perceived. His lines captured staircases folding in on themselves, hallways extending into infinity, shadows stretching impossibly along walls. James realized the boy was translating the distortions into something tangible, a map of the ship's hidden movements. Yet each sketch seemed to shift subtly when glanced at later, as if the pages themselves were bending to the ship's will. Meals became unnerving. The food was impeccably arranged, but wrong in ways he could not identify. Meat seemed darker, unidentifiable, glistening oddly. Vegetables shimmered as if wet with something other than water. Passengers ate mechanically, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. Occasionally, someone would stop, gaze at a distant point in the corridor or horizon, and vanish, leaving plates untouched, chairs empty. James could no longer ignore the connection. The ship and ocean were orchestrating the disappearances. The crew, too, had changed. Faces remained calm, movements precise, eyes attentive but vacant. They navigated hallways and staircases with mechanical grace, guiding passengers subtly, nudging them toward or away from areas the ship deemed critical. James realized the vessel had co-opted the crew, making them instruments of its design, executing rules invisible to human comprehension. By afternoon, the rhythm of vanishings intensified. James noted subtle cues, vibrations in the hull, flickers of light along corridors, shadows bending in unnatural ways. Each sign preceded a disappearance. The pulse beneath the ship matched the pattern, and James began to understand that awareness itself, the act of noticing the ship's behavior, might provoke its response. Danny's sketches became more frantic. Intricate patterns of twisting shapes and spiraling corridors that mimicked the forms of the ship's distortions. James noticed a subtle correlation. Whenever Danny finished a sketch, the ship seemed to adjust slightly, walls aligning, corridors extending or contracting, shadows repositioning. The boy's perception had become part of the ship's feedback loop, as though the vessel used his awareness to calibrate its manipulations. Night brought no relief. The gray horizon pressed against the cabin windows like an endless wall. Shadows along corridors stretched into geometric impossibilities. The low hum pulsed beneath the deck, threading into consciousness, reminding every passenger that the ship was aware, patient, and deliberate. James lay awake, listening, aware that every heartbeat, every breath, and every motion was catalogued and measured by the living vessel. Disappearances had reduced the number of passengers drastically. Chairs remained empty. Cabins were sealed, and corridors echoed with absence. The family understood with clarity. The vanishings were not accidents or random acts. They were part of a system, a deliberate pattern, a ritual the ship enacted to align reality with the awareness below the hull. By the end of the day, James realized the full extent of the horror. The ocean outside, the ship, the shadows, and the vanishings were all connected. The ship was alive, the ocean aware, and the disappearances were part of a meticulous cycle, predating their voyage. The passengers were not victims of chance. They were elements in a design older and larger than any human mind could comprehend. The third day closed with the family huddled together in the cabin. Danny traced spirals in the air, his movements mirroring the distorted corridors he had sketched. Lisa stared at the endless gray, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed. James listened to the hum, understood the rhythm, and knew with a chilling certainty that the vanishings would continue. The ship waited. The ocean waited. And whatever force guided them would not be done until every element had played its part. The cruise had become a trap. Escape was no longer a possibility. The passengers were woven into the rhythm, integral to the living labyrinth that spanned steel and water, human minds and shadow. And the third day had proven one inescapable truth. Awareness itself was dangerous, curiosity a liability, and the ocean's patience infinite. By the fourth day, the ship had fully revealed its strangeness. Hallways twisted subtly, staircases folded into impossible loops, and cabins appeared where none should exist. Shadows moved independently along walls, stretching unnaturally. The passengers who remained were tense, cautious, haunted by the disappearances of their fellow travelers. James, Lisa, and Danny navigated carefully, recording patterns, marking corridors, but even then, memory proved unreliable. In one deserted lounge, James discovered a leather-bound journal, water-stained and brittle, tucked beneath a cushion. Its pages bore the handwriting of someone who had experienced the ship before. The words spoke of endless corridors, shifting walls, and shadows that were more than trickery of light. The writer described disappearances, the feeling of being watched, and an ocean that was alive, patient, and deliberate. James's pulse quickened. The journal confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The ship had a history far older than this voyage. As he read, the journal's entries revealed patterns of behavior. Passengers were drawn to certain decks, corridors bent around them, and some vanished without warning. Crew members moved with mechanical precision, eyes hollow, performing rituals that no human could fully understand. The ship itself seemed alive, guiding movement, shaping perception, and influencing thought. James recognized these patterns in the distortions he and Danny had observed, in the disappearances, and in the eerie alignment of shadows along the walls. Danny sketched in silence, pages filled with spirals and geometries that matched the journal's descriptions. James noticed that the boy's drawings were becoming increasingly abstract, yet precise. The child's perception mirrored the ship's distortions, translating them into a language that adults could not grasp. Lisa traced her finger along the edges of the journal's pages, reading the faint, fading ink, aware that these words represented experience, knowledge, and warning. The journal spoke of the ocean outside as a living entity, vast, patient, and aware. Its movements beneath the ship, subtle and deliberate, influenced the hull's vibrations, the corridor's layout, and the behavior of those aboard. James realized that the disappearances were not random. The ship and the ocean were engaged in a deliberate, intertwined cycle, shaping reality to suit an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Even the crew seemed guided by the journal's warnings. James observed them performing routines with uncanny precision, as though each step and gesture were predetermined. Faces remained calm. Hands moved with deliberate grace. Eyes flicked toward corridors and shadows, as if perceiving patterns hidden from passengers. The vessel had co-opted the crew, turning them into instruments of its design. By mid-afternoon, the journal revealed a new horror. Previous passengers who had vanished were, in some accounts, never truly gone. Some entries suggested echoes, reflections of their presence embedded in the corridors, in shadows, in objects. The ship retained memory, awareness, and perhaps even fragments of consciousness. James shivered, realizing that disappearances might not be permanent in the way humans understood them. The ship's cycles were patient, and the ocean's reach was infinite. Danny's sketches became increasingly frantic. Spirals overlapped with geometric forms, corridors twisted on paper as they had in reality. James observed a subtle alignment between Danny's drawings and the distortions in the corridors outside, as if the child's perception were tuning into the ship's consciousness, providing a map of its movements and intentions. Lisa noted this too, a quiet terror knitting her posture, understanding that awareness itself was dangerous. By evening, corridors had shifted again. Doors led to spaces that had never existed. Staircases elongated or folded, and shadows moved independently of any light source. James realized that the journal was both warning and guide. It revealed patterns, but it could not prevent the next disappearance. Observing the ship's movements was no guarantee of survival. The vessel was patient, aware, and deliberate. Outside, the gray ocean pressed against the windows, unbroken and infinite. Waves reflected no light, yet beneath the surface, subtle movements hinted at a massive presence, undulating in rhythm with the hull's vibrations. The journal had described this, and now James could see it. The ocean was not passive. It was a living entity, interacting with the ship, guiding its distortions, influencing perception, and demanding participation. Night arrived with oppressive quiet. Shadows stretched into impossible angles, corridors curved into forms that defied geometry, and the hum beneath the hull pulsed through steel and bone alike. James lay awake, the journal open beside him, tracing faded lines, rereading passages that confirmed the ship's intelligence. Danny slept fitfully, fingers tracing shapes in the air that mirrored his sketches. Lisa remained near the window, eyes wide, aware that the vessel itself was alive and aware of their presence. By the end of the fourth day, one truth was undeniable. The ship and the ocean were intertwined, patient, and deliberate. The journal had preserved the knowledge of those who had come before, but it could not change the outcome. Passengers were components in a system beyond comprehension, their awareness, fear, and observation part of the vessel's design. Escape was impossible, and the cycle would continue, indifferent to human understanding. The cruise had become an initiation into an ancient and deliberate system. The ship remembered, the ocean waited, and the distortions pressed on. James understood, with bone-deep certainty, that the journal was not just a record, It was a warning, a map, and a key to surviving the next phase. But survival would require more than knowledge. It would require patience, observation, and an acceptance of the ship's rules. By the fifth day, the ship had become unrecognizable. Hallways twisted at impossible angles, staircases looped into themselves, and cabins appeared where none should exist. The metal hull vibrated constantly, a low, unyielding hum threading through every floor, wall, and ceiling. Shadows moved independently of light, bending along surfaces in geometric impossibilities. James understood that the vessel itself had become an extension of the ocean, alive, deliberate, and aware. Passengers moved cautiously, navigating corridors with heightened attention. Some were terrified, frozen in place or retreating into cabins. Others wandered compulsively, tracing loops they could not map. Chairs remained empty where people had vanished, and corridors echoed with absence. James clutched Danny's hand, aware that the boy's perception of the ship's distortions might hold a fragile key to survival. Danny sketched constantly, lines twisting, overlapping, forming spirals and shapes that mirrored the ship's strange geometry. James realized that the boy was translating perception into something tangible, capturing the distortions of corridors, staircases, and shadows in a way adults could not. Each sketch seemed to interact with the ship, subtly influencing the alignment of walls and passageways. Even the crew had become instruments of the vessel. Faces were calm and expressionless. Hands moved with mechanical precision. Eyes flicked toward shadows and corridors as if perceiving patterns invisible to passengers. The ship guided them subtly, using their movements to enforce its rhythm, maintaining the patterns that ensured each passenger remained part of the system. The ocean beyond the windows remained a flat, unbroken gray. Subtle undulations beneath the surface pulsed with the same rhythm as the ship, as if the water itself were alive. James noted the correlation between the hull's vibrations and the patterns on the surface. Both were deliberate, measured, and in constant dialogue. The ship and ocean were entwined, and passengers were caught in the space between. By midday, the ship's transformations accelerated. Hallways narrowed, then widened. Doors led to rooms that defied memory. Shadows lengthened, shifted, and folded along walls. James recognized that the vessel was not simply altering space. It was manipulating perception, bending awareness, and enforcing participation. Movement itself had consequences. Step incorrectly, linger too long, or observe too closely, and the ship might claim you. Disappearances continued. A passenger who had lingered near the bow vanished without warning, leaving no trace. James observed the mechanism. A subtle shift in vibration, a twist of shadows, and then absence. The ship cataloged presence, gauged attention, and adjusted accordingly. Awareness itself had become dangerous, curiosity a liability. Danny's sketches became increasingly frantic, dense with spirals and overlapping shapes. James noticed that when Danny stopped, Walls would subtly realign, corridors would adjust, and shadows would shift, as if the boy's perception tuned the vessel's consciousness. Lisa watched in quiet horror, tracing the patterns with her finger, realizing that the child's insight was both a warning and a map. By afternoon, the ship's transformations had reached a surreal intensity. Corridors folded into themselves, staircases twisted beyond comprehension, and rooms appeared or disappeared at random. Shadows gathered in corners, forming shapes that defied logic yet felt purposeful. The hum beneath the hull pulsed in perfect synchronization with the distortions, embedding itself in consciousness and nerve, a reminder of the ship's sentience. The family retreated to their cabin, observing the changes through the window. The gray horizon outside remained flat and endless, yet subtle ripples hinted at a massive presence beneath the surface. James realized with chilling clarity that the ocean was guiding the ship, shaping every movement and observing every action aboard. The disappearances, distortions, and transformations were deliberate, part of a system older than any human understanding. Night brought oppressive quiet. The corridors had shifted once more. Doors opened to voids, staircases folded, and shadows stretched impossibly along the walls. The hum beneath the hull pulsed with intensity, threading through the ship and passengers alike. James lay awake, listening, aware that the vessel itself was alive, aware of their presence, and patient in its deliberation. By the end of the 5th day, the family understood one undeniable truth. The ship was no longer simply a vessel. It had become an organism, conscious, aware, and deliberate, bending space, perception, and reality itself. Passengers were no longer travelers. They were components in an intricate system designed to observe, test, and integrate. Escape was impossible. Resistance was irrelevant. Survival depended on understanding the rhythm, observing without provoking, and remaining part of the cycle. The cruise had become a trap. The ship remembered, the ocean watched, and the distortions pressed onward, reshaping reality one corridor, one shadow, one heartbeat at a time. And the 5th day had made it abundantly clear. The living vessel would continue to evolve, patient and unyielding, until every element fulfilled its role. By the 6th day, the ship had become a vessel of perception and fear. The gray ocean stretched endlessly, its surface calm yet alive with subtle undulations. James felt the pulse of the water through the hull, a rhythm threading through steel, walls, and bone alike. Every passenger sensed it, though none could explain why it unsettled them so deeply. Danny clutched his sketchbook, tracing spirals and twisting corridors. The boy's perception had sharpened. He could see what adults could only sense. Shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, bending toward him as if recognizing his awareness. James noticed a subtle pattern. Each line Danny drew mirrored the distortions of the ship and the ripples across the water outside. The disappearances continued. Chairs were empty, cabins silent, and hallways echoed with absence. The ship's subtle vibrations grew stronger, pulses synchronized with the undulating movements of the ocean. James understood that the vessel and water were aware of their presence, observing, cataloging, and adjusting the environment to suit some incomprehensible rhythm. By midday, a dark form appeared beneath the surface. It was massive, impossible to measure, shifting beneath the waves in curling fluid motions. James felt its awareness extend toward the ship, touching him through the vibration in his chest. Danny sketched frantically, capturing tentacle-like shapes and twisting spirals. Lisa watched with horror, realizing that the ocean below was not passive. It was alive, deliberate, and focused. The ship itself seemed to respond. Corridors shifted subtly, walls realigned, and shadows lengthened in time with the pulse of the water. Crew members moved with mechanical precision, guiding passengers without speaking. Their movements synchronized with the unseen rhythm below. James realized they were instruments of the vessel, extensions of a consciousness he could not understand. By evening, the shadow partially rose above the surface, appendages curling and twisting with deliberate intent. The hum of the hull intensified, threading through every nerve, every thought. Passengers froze, unable to move or speak, caught between awe and terror. James understood that the family's observation itself had drawn attention. Awareness was a risk. It provoked the entity and elicited response. The night was oppressive. The corridors folded unnaturally, staircases twisted, and walls seemed to breathe. Danny's sketches became increasingly complex, spiraling into impossible geometries. James realized the boy had become a conduit, translating the alien forms into human understandable lines. Lisa's hand gripped his tightly, aware that the entity below and the ship above were both patient and deliberate. By the end of the sixth day, James understood the enormity of their situation. The shadow was not merely a creature. It was the ocean itself manifesting awareness through the ship. The passengers were woven into a rhythm older than memory, part of a deliberate, infinite cycle. Escape was impossible. Observation alone had become participation. The family huddled near the cabin window, watching the vast gray expanse, understanding that the final stage of the cycle was near. The seventh day arrived with no change in the gray expanse. The horizon was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of ocean. James felt the weight of inevitability pressing in, a pressure threading through the ship and into the mind. The vessel was no longer simply alive. It was deliberate, aware, patient, and infinite. The shadow below had grown in size and clarity. Massive appendages undulated in the gray water, curling and twisting with synchronized precision. The low hum of the hull had intensified, threading through consciousness, embedding itself in every thought, every nerve ending. Passengers moved cautiously, aware that any action could provoke the entity. Danny's sketches had become chaotic yet precise, translating the shadow and the ship's distortions into spirals and twisting shapes. James noticed subtle feedback. When Danny drew, corridors shifted, walls realigned, and shadows moved in response. The boy had become part of the system, a key in the living mechanism of the vessel. Lisa stayed close, eyes scanning the gray horizon, aware that their understanding mattered as much as their observation. Disappearances accelerated. One by one, passengers vanished, mid-step, mid-motion, with no trace left behind. James observed the pattern. Movement, attention, curiosity, all measured by the ship and the ocean. Awareness itself was dangerous. Each heartbeat and glance could provoke absorption. Chairs remained empty, cabins sealed, and corridors echoed only with absence. By midday, the family felt the ship's full control. Hallways twisted into impossible forms, staircases folded into themselves, and shadows bent along walls in unnatural geometry. The ocean's pulse beneath the hull and the hum of the ship aligned, threading perception, movement, and consciousness into a single, living rhythm. The shadow below tested them, observing and cataloging each motion, each line of Danny's sketches. The family retreated to the bow, drawn by a force they could neither resist nor understand. The shadow surfaced partially, appendages curling toward the vessel, its awareness palpable through every vibration. James realized that the ocean and ship had merged into a single entity, observing and integrating the passengers into its pattern. The final circle was near. The low hum became a tangible pulse, threading through body and mind. Shadows along the walls and corridors stretched, folded, and gathered, moving with deliberate intent. Danny traced spirals in the air, copying his sketches, and James understood. They were required participants. Resistance was irrelevant. Observation, acknowledgement, and synchronization were the only options. Night fell, and the ship, the ocean, and the shadow converged in rhythm. Hallways twisted into loops, staircases bent, and walls pressed inward. The family felt themselves integrated into the cycle. Their movements, perceptions, and awareness now part of the living system. Escape was impossible. Disappearance irrelevant. They were threads in a design beyond comprehension. As the seventh day ended, James understood the terrifying truth. The ship and ocean were patient, eternal, and deliberate. The shadow below, the corridors, the vibrations, and the disappearances were part of an infinite cycle. Awareness itself had become participation. Observation was obligation. The final circle had been drawn, yet it would never end. The family huddled together at the bow, clinging to each other as the gray ocean pressed in from every side. The ship drifted forward into eternity. The shadow pulsed beneath the waves, patient and unyielding, waiting for the next cycle, the next final circle, the next iteration of horror. They were not merely witnesses. They had become integral components in an endless, living labyrinth.